Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Adam Fivenson, who is the Senior Program Officer for Information Space Integrity at the National Endowment for Democracy's International Forum for Democratic Studies, where he conducts research on the integrity in the information space and countering authoritarian information activities. Adam Fivenson, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, so the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Adam, will cover your co-authored piece from back in the February timeframe, Shielding Democracy, Civil Society Adaptations to Kremlin Disinformation about Ukraine. And of course, we will have a link to this in the show notes for those who would like to check it out further. But before we get into this article and topic, could we start, Adam, please, by getting your overall assessment of our strategic landscape?
Of course. Well, I should begin by saying that where I sit at the National Endowment for Democracy, within the International Forum for Democratic Studies, our focus is really on understanding threats to democracy in the information space, particularly those threats advanced by authoritarian powers like Russia and China. So what we look at really is how these actors exercise what we call sharp power, or efforts at censorship or manipulation of the information space that at the end of the day seek to sap the integrity of independent institutions. And so, we understand that Russia and China aren't the only actors that are present in the information space, particularly among threat actors, particularly around elections, but they're active in many places. They repeat their tactics. They have a lot of funding, and they have few qualms about stoking social unrest or dividing people, as we've seen in both information and physical spaces all around the world. So to just answer your more specific question about the strategic landscape, I would point to a few critical trends that, at least in my mind, are indicators of how our information environment is changing and why that might matter, especially in the coming year. So let me start with two trends that are concerning, and then I'll have two trends that give me more hope, because not everything in the information space is doom and gloom, and then we can potentially expand on some of the second half there. So just a few words to kind of lay the land here. I'll lay the land. There are more than 50 national elections taking place between now and the end of 2024. There are major democracies, countries like Mexico, Argentina, South Africa, Tunisia, India, Taiwan, even the European Parliament, that are holding national, parliamentary, or presidential elections. The quality of information around those elections matters for the decision that they end up producing. Our interest in terms of democracy is to see an information space where we're seeing good civic information. What the German Marshall Fund's new civic information handbook says is information that people find reliable and that they need to participate in democracy. So that's information about health, education, about the environment, about people running for office, and to make sure that civic information isn't drowned out by falsehoods, that seek to divide, that seek to protect bad actors, or to smear people of integrity. So just to come back to the actual trends themselves, now that we've kind of laid out the environment for the next year to 14 months here, there are two big changes taking place at social media messaging companies that, to me, I think are really relevant to what's happening in the information space, particularly as it regards the ability of some of these global authoritarian actors to influence democratic information spaces. So the first is that over the past year, there have been some pretty significant cuts at major social media and messaging companies. In large part, these moves have affected civic integrity staff, who are the people that are really there to prepare these platforms for elections, identify and prevent, the amplification of manipulative narratives, to design product features that amplify, again, good civic information. These teams still exist, but they're in much smaller numbers. And of course, the platforms are in just about every environment, all over the world. Much more so than 5 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago. I saw a number published by We Are Social, global marketing company, that pointed out that between 2015 and 2021, the global population of social media users doubled from about 2.3 billion to over 4.6. I'm sure that number is, significantly increased even since then. And I'm sure if you look at the We Are Social 2023 report, you would see that, these platforms are active just about everywhere. So the other trend in terms of what's happening at platforms that I want to just highlight before I move on here is the reductions in data access for social science researchers who really use platform engagement data to draw conclusions about the social impact, of changes that the platforms make to their feed algorithms, to other aspects of the user experience. This is an ongoing trend. It's been getting worse over time. Meta has largely stopped supporting the CrowdTangle tool that a lot of researchers were using to understand the changes they were making. Twitter, or X, has closed their formerly open API, which really allowed researchers to access, a really significant subset of the available tweets. And without that access, it's actually becoming a lot harder for researchers to understand, what some of these changes mean for society. Now they have to pay $42,000 a month to get that access, or work through one of, I think, 7 or 8 approved data brokers that also cost thousands a month. So it really displaces the work of a lot of the smaller civil society groups that Ned works with to understand what's happening in the information space. So just some of these changes at the platforms are really concerning, and what they might mean for elections, again, happening all over the world. But beyond that, we're also very concerned about these new developments with generative AI tools. There's a very active debate in the information space about how concerned we should all be about these tools and their capacity for producing massive waves of manipulative content, especially around elections, and really to do so at tremendously low cost and with significantly less requirement of human engagement than the kind of earlier iterations of these sorts of systems. Some people would argue that we're already seeing this taking place, that there are already examples of authoritarian regimes using these kinds of tools. There are examples out of Venezuela, Burkina Faso, and a few others that Vice has covered. But my sense is that we haven't seen the worst of it yet. There's a lot more coming, particularly as we start to look at the opportunity to use text-to-image tools like Midjourney or text-to-video tools like Stable Diffusion, as those become more user-friendly and easy to use. So those are the two trends that I'm concerned about. I can jump on, move on now to the trends that give me some confidence or hope, or I can pause here if you want to react to that at all.
Wow. Well, you said a lot there, Adam. And while you were talking, I did a web search, and we can put a link to that We Are Social 2023 report that you referenced, and also back up to the top of some of the items you were discussing with elections. Yeah, like, wow, when you described the global election landscape the way that you did, and I can't recap it, but basically like hundreds of elections happening globally just this year, right? But before we started recording, you mentioned another episode that of the podcast that you listened to with Dan Runde from a couple of months ago. But he also talked about elections, but he was talking about elections within like the United Nations context, and within the UN there are elections to various different important positions within that institution as well, which are also elections that we need to be sitting up and paying attention to. So anyway, I just really like that framework that you were sketching out about being mindful of the elections that are happening, and doing what we can to ensure that globally elections are free and fair to the extent that we have some influence over that. So I guess that's my reaction.
No, that's great. That's great. And I agree 100%, both about the UN itself. We know that some of the major institutions of the UN, there's a strong push from China in particular to gain a toehold there, and to push back on some of the multilateral approaches to managing important global issues, trade, information security, all kinds of things. So that's absolutely on our radar as well. I would also just then maybe I can expand a little bit and say there are two sort of trends that actually give me some confidence for the coming year. And the first is the implementation of the Digital Services Act in the European Union. It's sort of a flagship moment for democratic accountability in the digital information space. And, for the first time, large tech companies will actually be obligated by a multilateral governing body to really provide researchers with quite a relevant and useful and significant amount of data, around the goal of limiting the spread of disinformation under the DSA's new code of practice around disinformation. And the idea being that GDPR had some of these sort of similar protections in place, but the enforcement wasn't there. With DSA and with the new code of practice, the idea is that really they're designing enforcement mechanisms that force especially large tech platforms that have millions and millions of users to have to be responsive, right? To have to be responsible for the sort of content that they're shepherding into the information space. So not just in terms of what it will mean for the UN or rather within the EU, but what it will mean for countries around the globe, it's something that we're all kind of paying close attention to. The other trend that I would just point to is really the experience of the last year and a half since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the really leadership of Ukrainian civil society and journalists, the leadership that they've shown. It's been nothing short of an inspiration and a rallying cry for democracies and for folks who are active in the information space, I think, all around the globe. That's what my experience is, someone who's speaking to folks doing this work in all different contexts. If we look at Ukrainian and Central and Eastern European countries and Taiwan as well, actually, these are really some of the leading country contexts, particularly civil society and journalists in these regions that are sort of piloting proactive efforts to secure their information spaces for good civic information. Those lessons are getting out to the rest of the world, and that's actually part of the work that I'm engaged here at the forum, is taking some of those learnings from a context like Ukraine and looking for ways that we can help civil society, researchers, and journalists, among others, to really utilize and put to practice some of those same approaches in their context. So that gives us some confidence, seeing the ability of the Ukrainians and other folks who are supporting them to defend their information space. And I know we'll talk in just a little while about what success looks like and why we think they've been successful. But we truly, based on our experience and Ned's engagement and support of these organizations, it's our sense that the work that they're doing, because of their historical experience, because of their current experience, frankly, is particularly informed and well targeted. So we'll talk more about that in a minute, but that's kind of the second trend that gives me some confidence for where we're heading.
Right. Yeah, I really do appreciate that perspective too. That it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, the world's a dangerous place. The world's also a beautiful place, and being able to hold those two realities or those two facts together, I think, is important for people to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
So let's get into your piece a little bit that you co-authored, "Shielding Democracy." Why did you and your colleagues write this?
Yeah, well, as I was sort of hinting at, I think one of the advantages that the International Forum for Democratic Studies, has in terms of think tanks, is really our access through the broader institution here, the National Endowment for Democracy. It provides us opportunities to connect with experts, on the ground who are directly engaged with the work of defending democracy and expanding space for democracy, from authoritarian actors and in all kinds of different settings. Ned supports civil society organizations and journalists in Ukraine, around Central and Eastern Europe, and in countries where there's a deep-seated understanding of how the Kremlin Kremlin uses information campaigns going back to well before the sort of current full-scale invasion back to the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, when so many countries in Central and Eastern Europe were themselves under Soviet influence, and some, of course, felt the Soviet occupation. So they have that experience, they have that understanding. It was our sense, based on a couple of convenings that we hosted with some of these actors, and a series of interviews that I conducted, that they had a really unique understanding of this challenge of authoritarian information operations, and not just during active war, but in Ukraine going back to 2014, how the Kremlin, in particular, uses information operations as part of their sharp power efforts to sort of soften democratic society's resilience to authoritarian influence, to weaken independent institutions, to weaken the balance of powers, to weaken systems of accountability, and to widen the cracks for kleptocracy, for corruption, for those practices to replace democratic elections and accountability as sort of key factors in public policy and government policy. And so we saw that experience, that again, what we perceive to be success in that context, and we're very eager to sort of highlight the work that we saw happening. Our sense is they have such a strong understanding of how to push back on these types of attacks on democracy. And especially since the full-scale invasion began, we look at organizations in Ukraine like Detect Your Media, like Stop Fake, like Vox Ukraine, like the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, among others, that have really led the way in what we call setting the baseline for truth and getting civic information out to people amid an absolute hailstorm of Russian information operations designed to soften Ukraine as a target, designed to help Russia itself elude responsibility for the invasion, for the atrocities that its forces have committed in Ukraine, and to divide Ukraine from its NATO allies. And I'll just wrap it up here saying, it's not just in Ukraine. We think there are lots of organizations around Central and Eastern Europe that are doing incredible work on this. One of my co-authors came from an organization called European Values in the Czech Republic. They do excellent work. Political Capital in Hungary, the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights in Poland, Globsec in Slovakia, among others, in their own context, are pushing back on divisive Kremlin narratives, often designed to sort of create tension about Ukrainian refugees, about NATO, about energy supplies during winter, about all these sort of politically charged topics. So, we know the Kremlin is active in lots of places, and our goal really was to take try to draw some key learnings, that come from direct engagement with these organizations, with these individuals doing the work, and then look for opportunities to share some of that expertise with folks, fighting similar battles, although of course not necessarily in a kinetic, combat context. But other folks who are fighting these same battles, particularly civil society organizations, and see if those same lessons apply. So that was sort of the thinking.
Yeah, excellent. So what are some of the critical lessons that you and your colleagues have teased out relative to countering Russian information operations in the Ukraine context, and then how can some of these lessons be projected out into other areas of the globe?
Yeah, wonderful. Well, yeah, I would say that for us, across the sort of series of convenings and interviews that we did, I felt strongly that there were three kind of critical factors that came up. And I should just pause for a second to clarify, that our focus is on civil society. That's the work that NED does. We believe that civil society carries the values, the norms of a society. It exists across political transitions. As countries move, into safer space in terms of democracy, as countries, descend into more authoritarian modes of governance, that civil society is still there doing the work that they do. And so a lot of our focus, both in terms of learning, but also recommendations, has to do with civil society. So that's researchers, it's journalists, it's data analysts, it's folks who are doing sort of communication around these issues. All different types of organizations that are not government and not the private sector, who are engaged in these challenges. So I'll say more about that in a second. But there were kind of three core lessons that we looked at. The first being sort of deep preparation, and I'll explain that more in a moment. What we call open networks of cooperation, and the third being active utilization of new technologies. And so in terms of deep preparation, what we mean is sort of looking back to Ukraine's Revolution of Dignity in 2014, which saw thousands of Ukrainians protesting the then president Yanukovych's decision not to sign the accession papers into the EU, which led to massive protests right in the center of Kyiv and his ouster. At the same time, the protests also kind of signaled the beginning of the Kremlin's current hybrid war in Ukraine, rolling out narratives, kind of smearing these pro-Europe protesters as fascists, as neo-Nazis. Of course, we're still seeing those narratives being used to justify the invasion, but at that time they were used to justify the sort of little green men annexation of Crimea and then Eastern Ukraine. And so since that time, our sense is that Ukrainian civil society organizations in particular have really worked effectively to push back on Russian lies, and to defend the integrity of the information space in Ukraine for democracy. Early efforts were really characterized by sort of the development of a group of organizations focused on fact checking and providing good information about kind of what was true, what wasn't. But over time, it became clear that fact checking was really tremendously important, but by itself may not have been enough. And there was a need to go a bit deeper, be more proactive in anticipating what those Russian narratives might be based on experience, and then working to inoculate the population, to Russian information operations using tools like media literacy, using tools like community engagement, social behavior change type approaches, to sort of let folks know, here's what you might be seeing, here's what you might be hearing, here's why Russia would want you to think that, in relation to the war, and their efforts in the kinetic space, and here's what the reality is, so here's what the truth is. And so by preparing folks over time, we do see some significant changes in perceptions over time. One of them that we like to point to comes from Detector Media, another one of our partners, and actually the co-author of this report with me. They had some interesting data from a 2019 survey that they conducted within Ukraine that I think identified only about 49% of Ukrainians at that time understood that Russia had started the hostilities in the east and in Crimea. And of course, like in our personal lives, not the biggest deal to sort of whose fault the thing is. We all want to move on and solve the problem. But in this context, there is no solution without understanding who's behind the invasion. If we don't know who invaded, why the war started in Ukraine, then we can't stop that actor from doing it again. And so, of course, Russia doesn't want even Ukrainians to fully understand what's happening, in that context. So again, 49% understood that it was Russia in 2019, and due in large part to the efforts of civil society, of journalists who were working to inform the Ukrainian population on this. By late 2021, just before the invasion, roughly 68 to 69% actually did understand that it was Russia that had started it. So almost 20% increase. It's pretty significant in terms of media impact and messaging. So that's pretty impressive. So that's kind of the story around preparation, right? It's kind of developing these fact-checking tools, fact-checking approaches, evolving to narrative approaches, evolving to more collaboration, evolving to use new tools and technologies. And so that's kind of my segue into points 2 and 3 here. The first being this question of open networks of cooperation. And so what we mean by that is that, civil society organizations have really, our sense is that within Ukraine, they've really leveraged common values and diverse skill sets to form, some of these networks that have the sophistication and the speed necessary to combat the scale and again, the speed of the Kremlin's information machine. I think we can call it that. These networks have developed multidisciplinary approaches to the challenge across governmental, non-governmental, and even private sector entities. And they really work together to identify information campaigns and narratives, to highlight the underlying messages, the goals, and the target audiences for public awareness, and then to work together to design, even co-design, timely, effective responses that are amplified by like-minded civil society groups, by researchers, by journalists, and even the Ukrainian government. Some of these cooperative networks have also provided a really valuable forum for disinformation researchers to share their learnings, share lessons, and highlight best practices, to limit the duplication of efforts among them, since they're all strapped for resources. And to really encourage some of the, sort of citizen-led efforts to participate in counter disinformation. And if I can just mention a couple examples, one will be the National Democratic Institute's Disinformation Hub, the International Republican Institute's Beacon Project, the Zinc Network's Open Information Partnership, and the Black Sea Trust, which is run by the German Marshall Fund. We think those are all great examples of the type of collaboration that's necessary to counter the speed, and frankly, the scale, right, of a lot of these Russian information operations that are active within Ukraine and around the region. And then I'll just touch on this third piece here, since I'm talking a lot. Which is the active utilization of new technologies, especially AI. There's a lot of gloom and doom right now about what AI might mean, and especially generative AI. And as I mentioned earlier, I certainly connect and understand that. We also think that there are opportunities for organizations that are active countering disinformation to use artificial intelligence tools, to get their message across. And we know that even the most well-staffed civil society organizations can struggle to monitor the sort of vast and emergent series of disinformation narratives, across rapidly evolving information environments. New apps are popping up, old apps are going away. there are AI tools and machine learning tools that are actually empowering disinformation researchers to identify and to attribute new Russian narratives more quickly, and to design effective responses before those narratives can cross channels, cross platforms, cross outlets, go online and offline. It's this idea of the breakout scale, as Ben Nimmo calls it, that we're trying to sort of prevent or essentially break early on, but before those narratives can kind of cross all those different boundaries, to sort of start to build resilience, debunk, pre-bunk, and again kind of build society's resilience to these sorts of narratives before they kind of reach a critical mass of people. So our sense is that AI in that context is really useful, and there are some organizations in that context that are making some important strides in deploying it, to counter Russian narratives.
Well, so obviously you and your colleagues have done a very deep dive into all of this, especially from through a civil society lens. But so what does success look like in countering information operations, would you say?
Well, it's a tremendously difficult question, and thankfully, we're definitely not the only ones thinking about it. One might start by asking how prevalent are information operations, and look at methodologies for identifying those operations, and look at their traffic numbers and compare them over time. To sort of the competing civic information narratives. For me, the challenge of kind of using metrics, traffic metrics, is that there's simply too many ways to game a system like that, particularly through kind of troll and bot armies. I think it can give you a general heuristic of how popular a certain narrative or counter narrative is, but I don't think it kind of gets at the core of the issue from a democracy perspective. So to answer the question more effectively, we really relied on the work of the National Democratic Institute, or NDI, and the International Republican Institute, or IRI, both of which are quite closely affiliated with NED, as well as the local journalistic outlet Detector Media, who I mentioned a little earlier, to actually conduct polling around key issues, including to sort of determine the impact of certain key Kremlin narratives, about the invasion, about Russia, about NATO, about Ukraine itself. And there were a few things that really popped out to us, and that to me were kind of strong indicators of success, at least in this particular context. So according to certain polling that NDI did, Ukrainians have remained at or above 85% of support for territorial integrity and independence from Russia, essentially since the very early days of the war. They have also actually, as I mentioned earlier, really benefited from increased awareness about critical events. And I mentioned earlier that increase from 49% to 65% in understanding who was really behind the full-scale invasion between 2019 and 2021. The other metric, just kind of continuing with this public polling piece, that we really keyed in on, was a Eurobarometer survey of European citizens that was released in December 2020. About 10 months after the full-scale invasion, found that 74% of the EU continue to support Ukraine. So given that Russia's primary goal in this context is to attack the very idea of Ukrainian territorial integrity and independence, and support for Ukraine from around the region, around Europe, that seems to us like there's some success, to be identified there, in that context. It's also important to note that there are many sectors beyond the democracy sector that are very concerned about the integrity of the information space, but have slightly different priorities. So if I were a health person, I might be looking at vaccine uptake in terms of success factors. If I were focused on climate, I might be looking for changes in CO2 outputs. But in the democracy sector, our sense is that polling is just about the best that we have. It's not perfect. It's only a snapshot of a particular moment. And of course, it's expensive. It can be time consuming. It's always a question around sampling methods and representation or representativeness of a particular sample. But our sense is that these kinds of questions are really useful in helping us to understand particular Kremlin information operations are actually impacting the way that society sees a certain factor, and that then allows us to sort of target limited resources, both for civil society and among governments, to responding to those narratives that are actually gaining traction, that are actually changing public perceptions over time.
I see. Have you and your colleagues given any thought, Adam, to how the challenges that are facing Ukraine, and that Ukraine has been living since, well, I guess going back quite a ways, 2014 for sure. How this compares to other regions which are grappling with authoritarian powers as well.
Absolutely. Well, there was certainly, we were tracking quite closely in the media an ongoing narrative about increasing efforts on the part of Russia and also on the part of China to engage more deeply in, global majority countries in Latin America, in Africa, in East Asia, engaging quite deeply, and actually in the Middle East as well, even though the type of governance tends to be a little bit different or quite a bit different in that context. The underlying goals remain the same: to destabilize democracy, to create space for authoritarian influence, to bolster local elites and voices who are willing to play ball, with the Kremlin or with the CCP, and to do so to kind of open the way for economic, for diplomatic, for military ties to grow. But regionally, in terms of narratives, in Africa, there's been a kind of constant drumbeat about a colonialism, which is part of an effort that Russia, through in many contexts, through the Wagner Group, has been seeking to roll out to kind of create more division between African countries and various European countries. And of course, we've seen that very recently with a number of coups that have taken place. Some of them with suspected Russian support, often channeled kind of through the Wagner Group in that context. In Latin America, there's some similarities, but also some differences. We've seen a certain kind of similar narrative about imperialism used in a very similar way to the colonialism narrative in Africa. But in Latin America, of course, it's very focused on the U.S. As the primary threat actor, and it seeks to sort of divide the U.S. from countries in Latin America. Having myself just come from Latin America relatively recently, we hosted a convening of disinformation experts and journalists in Buenos Aires back in June of this year to ask the question of what they were seeing, what the context looked like, and how they were responding. My sense is that there's a very strong fact-checking network and mechanism that's active in South and Central America. It's led by an organization called Chequeado, which is based in Argentina. They do amazing work fact-checking around elections. They're also doing some really interesting stuff working with other fact-checking organizations around the globe to sort of align data standards to allow them to be more predictive in their analysis, so they can get a better sense of kind of what's coming, which is really impressive. And it's, in terms of fact-checking, I would argue one of the really a leading approach, and they're a leading organization that's kind of pushing the envelope there. We also have a number of organizations of sort of independent journalistic organizations that are active around the region. One that I love is called El Faro, which is lighthouse is what it means. It's based in El Salvador, and they've been covering quite closely some of the work that the sort of budding dictator Nayib Bukele has been doing to sort of control the information space, tell a certain narrative about himself. Of course, at the expense of civil liberties and human rights in that context. And so there's some distinctions, I would say, on the whole. What I would say that in Latin America, what we're really interested in is, or what we've been interested in is, what is the reaction, what is the understanding and the response to some of these particularly global authoritarian actors in the region. Our sense is that Russia is very active in Latin America, spreading some of those divisive narratives, seeking to create space between the U.S. and countries in the region. Many of them have very real and historically grounded critiques of U.S. actions in the region. And I don't think it's our place as a democracy to tell them they're wrong. Frankly, I think it's our place as a democracy to have an open and honest conversation about that history, talk about what, how the U.S. has evolved in our approach to the region, and characterize the current approach, which is to support democracy and support democratic institutions, around the region. And of course, NET is an independent nonprofit, but we're, engaged in work that's aligned with that all over Latin America, in Africa and other regions as well. So, we see a significant amount, many examples of Russia-aligned information operations. I have a report coming out on this that'll be, I think, live in mid-November. So I'll be sure to share that with you. But the underlying sort of story is that at the moment we don't see as strong a recognition of why it matters that some of these global powers are driving some of these very divisive narratives, particularly around elections. And our sense of that is that, look, they're not democratically accountable. It's not the son or daughter of the defense minister who's out there marching in the streets with the young people pushing for democracy. And so they don't slow down or have to stop. And they also have massive resources and significant experience in breaking down democratic institutions. We know that in the Latin American context that both Russia and China are working very closely with Venezuela, with the Maduro regime. That Russia has been working very closely on messaging strategy. They've actually then advised. My understanding is that Venezuela has then sent advisors on to El Salvador to support Nayib Bukele in his messaging efforts. And then, of course, a lot of Chinese technology that is used for surveillance, is used for tracking people both within Venezuela and abroad. So we know that these authoritarian actors are very active in the region, are very eager to break down democracy, to work with compliant or partner local regimes, and that's having an impact in other places. So yeah, it's a concern. It's absolutely a concern.
Yeah, 100% on all that. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago, Adam, several organizations, I think in Africa and Latin America, they sounded like they were nonprofit or helping organizations. Do you think maybe you could send those to me so that we could be sure that we put a link to those in the show notes?
Absolutely, of course.
Okay, yeah, excellent. So to our audience, you guys can be sure to check that out. Well, this has been you and your colleagues are obviously doing some really important, necessary work and contributing to the good as it relates to Ukraine and globally, frankly. So thanks for what you guys are doing, and I'd like to close out, if we may, Adam. I've got a couple of typical questions I ask. So could you offer a fruitful research question that a student who's interested in these topics might take a crack at in order to help advance knowledge in these fields?
Of course. And I just thank you, John, for having me on. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and speak with your audience. So two questions. One, sort of tied to the work that I mentioned related to all these upcoming elections. I would ask, how will the many changes taking place in our information ecosystem impact the 50 plus national elections coming between now and the end of 2024? And I only bracket at 2024 because it's a useful, general projection to the future. But of course, there are many elections in 2025 as well. So we're very interested in some of these major changes that are happening at platforms, the introduction of generative AI, the introduction of the Digital Services Act, learnings coming from Ukraine and others who are having success in the information space, Taiwan as well. What should we anticipate for the coming year? How will it be easier or more difficult for authoritarian actors like Russia and China to, use their capabilities in the information space to break down democracies? And how will it be potentially more difficult, or maybe in some ways easier, for what we call civic actors to spread good civic information, around elections to help to ensure that people are able to make good decisions. So that would be one. And a second would be, based on their prior actions and efforts around the world, how might authoritarian actors take advantage of our evolving information spaces to spread divisive narratives that harm democracy? So that's sort of a more general one. It's kind of tied to the first question I was asking, but just kind of keeps the focus on some of these authoritarian actors who we know are very active in many contexts and seeking to break down democracy.
Excellent. And then finally, are there any other resources, books, online resources that you could suggest to our audience?
Well, I would be a fool not to point people to our report from February. As you mentioned, Shielding Democracy, Civil Society Adaptations to Kremlin Disinformation about Ukraine. You can find that online at bit.ly/shielding democracy. Again, that's bit.ly/shielding democracy. And I know John will drop the link into the show notes. As I mentioned a little earlier, we're also getting ready to put a report out, I think should be ready in November, that has to do with cross-border information operations and how some of these global authoritarian actors are working with regional allies to attack democracy. That'll focus on Latin America. But then I would also point you to some of the recent work coming out of the Atlantic Council, and particularly the Digital Forensic Research Lab. They have a couple of excellent reports on Russian tactics in the Ukraine context. If you look for their Russian war report, one of them is called Narrative Warfare, which is really about Russia's attacks on Ukraine, and the other one is called Undermining Ukraine, which looks kind of across the globe at Russian efforts to sort of poison the well in terms of support for Ukraine. And if I can just shoehorn one more in there, it's another recent report, actually, also by the Atlantic Council, that kind of looks at things more from the platform perspective, which is called Scaling Trust on the Web. Would highly recommend that. It's Kat Duffy who led that effort, and she's kind of asking, what will it mean, some of the major changes that we're hearing about and seeing at tech platforms, but trying to kind of zoom in on these civic integrity roles within platforms and how people who are fulfilling those types of roles can be allies to the broader democracy community as we seek to create, safer and more healthy information ecosystems for democracy. So yeah, those would be the three that I would point to.
All right, lots of resources for interested listeners in the show notes for this episode. And with that, Adam Fivenson, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much, John. Really looking forward to hearing more from you and from your other guests. I always appreciate listening to the podcast, and look forward to staying in touch.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.